presentation of the South Carolina Educational Television Network. Major funding for the Voices and Visions series is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Annenberg Media.
Additional series funding is provided by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. Special funding for this program is provided by the Pew Memorial Trust and the Vermont Council on the Humanities and Public Issues.
Matthew Arnold said, nature is cruel. It's man that's sick of blood, and man doesn't seem so very sick of it. Nature is always more or less cruel. And the woods are all killing each other anyway. That's where the expression came from, a place in the sun. Tree wanting a place in the sun that it can't get. The other trees won't give it to it.
I want to reach out to all sorts and kinds, Robert Frost once said. He said also, these poems are written in parable, so the wrong people won't understand and so be saved. He was unknown and virtually unpublished until almost 40, when the nation made him, like Whitman, an American symbol. Eventually, he became his own myth.
The buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard and made dust and dropped stove-lined sticks of wood, sweet-scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. And the saw snarled and rattled as it ran light or had to bear a load. That was one of the first Frost poems that I encountered, and my primary attraction, I suppose, was the sense of familiarity with the world that was in the poems. The world of actual hard rattling, buzzsaw snarling action of a farmyard. It seemed to me here was a poet who touched things as they are somehow.
Frost, when he talks about poetry, tends to make formulations that pull you up short. Poetry is organized violence with language. Is poetry a way of making one feel easier about life? Is an escape from life, would you say? And Frost said, no, it's a way of taking life by the throat. Organized violence upon language. No classic poet, no romantic poet, no Shelley, no Yeats would employ such an idiom, a way of taking life by the throat. Is he serious? Well, yes. Is he playful? Yes, indeed.
The land was ours before we were the land. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts and Virginia.
Robert Frost, beloved and in the hearts of Americans as much as any man, their poet laureate.
From early along, he's got a kind of ironic purchase on the myth, and yet he means it too. He is going to be known as the Yankee poet.
I like to be called a humanist, I guess, pretty well, though I'm not strictly a humanist. I guess I'm not a nature poet. I've only written 2 poems without a human being in them. Only 2. All my poems have got a person in them. Yes, oh yes, nature, too much nature, you know, you got to have people in them. Somebody said I had a good many trees, and he said he was going to write about it, and I said, well, go ahead, but don't be too arbitrary. It's a real story how I have done it. who first recognizes a good one. Not his hometown, because it's very hard in the village when the village idiot gets started.
But why was it an interesting life? Well, that's perhaps too big a question. Except that he was quite determined from very early on in his life to make this career into a myth of adversity overcome, triumphed over by the boys and the man's will that wrote the poems and fathered the children and lived the life that he lived. He says in one of his letters, "I kept farm, so to speak, for nearly 10 years, but less as a farmer than as a fugitive from the world that seemed to me to disallow me. It was all instinctive, but I can see now that I went away to save myself and fix myself before I measured my strength against all creation." This is the man making poetry, making a myth, if you will, out of those years of isolation, as he liked to think of them, on the farm at Derry.
I was a farmer all the time when I was doing other things. I always had a farm in the backyard.
Well, if you always have a farm in your backyard, are you a real farmer? Well, yes, no. A symbolic farmer. As he said, he was a symbolic teacher.
I got something out of being a teacher. I had to make things understood. And that put me in the class of poets that wanted to be understood. Someone has said a poet ought to learn all that all the other poets had ever said before he undertakes to say anything, so he'll avoid repetition, you know. But if he did that, he'd be 50 years old before he started. And all the poetry that was ever written was really started somewhere between 15 and 25, you know. You've got to start on insufficient knowledge. And you've got to have that kind of courage.
In 1905, in the sonnet Mowing, Frost demonstrated a fresh, subtle mixture of rhythms and voice tones. In one letter about the poem, he said, "I come so near what I long to get that I almost despair of coming nearer."
It's not writing school proficiency of mimicking the movement of a mower by the line breaks. It's a deeper rhythm of labor, as he said, the slightly lulling, consoling rhythm of a repeated motion. There was never a sound beside the wood but one, and that was my long scythe whispering to the ground. What was it? It whispered. I knew not well myself. That, what was it? It whispered. If you look at that on the page, what was it? It whispered. It's colloquial. It does have the little spring of spoken English about it.
What was it that whispered? I knew not well myself. Perhaps it was something about the heat of the sun. Something perhaps about the lack of sound, and that was why it whispered and did not speak. It was no dream of the gift of idle hours or easy gold at the hand of fay or elf. Anything more than the truth would have seemed too weak to the earnest love that laid the swale in rows, not without feeble-pointed spikes of flowers, pale orchises, and scared a bright green snake. The fact is the sweetest dream that labor knows. My long scythe whispered and left the hay to make.
The fact is the sweetest dream that labor knows. Period. My long scythe whispered and left the hay to make. The scythe is just going on, just making its sound, finishing its task. My long scythe whispered and left the hay to make. You leave it right there. You don't say any more. You don't try to connect up those two things. It's really the poet who makes poetry, not nature, not scythes.
He's not the kind of poet who works in large structures which require considerable advanced planning and a thorough knowledge of where one is going to arrive. That is, he doesn't work in the epic. He doesn't write cantos. He doesn't write suites like Wallace Stevens' more or less philosophical Man with the Blue Guitar. He's a lyric poet for whom the experience of writing is or seems passive. He doesn't go to the poem comes to him. What Frost calls the transition from delight to wisdom. You start with a happy perception, the thoughts then come, and the images then come. There are discoveries and surprises, and finally, there is a statement, and one has arrived at wisdom.
Certainly everything I've done, you know, there's always this element of extravagance. It's like snapping the whip, you know. Are you there? Are you still on, you know? Are you with it? Or has it snapped you off?
Another gift poem, if we're to believe himself, was After Apple Picking, which he says somewhere that he wrote out without fumbling a line. And it does have that sense, again, of something willowy and yielding. I think the rhythmic principle there is in the slight sway of the ladder on the yielding bough.
It's perfectly satisfying as a poem about a weary orchardist who has picked his last apple. But then there are certain words that have overtones to them. What Frost called displacements. My long two-pointed ladders sticking through a tree toward heaven still. He could have said sky, but he said heaven with a capital letter. So what he's telling you is that apple picking is an operation that takes place not on Earth and not amongst the stars, but partway there. And this word heaven has got its opposite in the poem. He says, for all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider apple heap as of no worth. Heaven and earth. Between heaven and earth, this apple picking, this aspirant activity goes on.
The way it can be taught in high school in a melodramatic way, say it's a poem about death, you know, and yet that robs it of all its life. It's Frost's Ode to Autumn. It's about hibernating. In fact, it's the one place where he does surrender to the woods.
My long two-pointed ladder sticking through a tree toward heaven still. And there's a barrel that I didn't fill beside it, and there may be 2 or 3 apples I didn't pick upon some bough. But I am done with apple picking now. Essence of winter sleep is on the night, the scent of apples. I am drowsing off. I cannot rub the strangeness from my sight I got from looking through a pane of glass I skimmed this morning from the drinking trough and held against the world of hoary grass. It melted, and I let it fall and break, but I was well upon my way to sleep before it fell, and I could tell what form my dreaming was about to take. Magnified apples appear and disappear, stem end and blossom end, and every fleck of russet showing clear. My instep arch not only keeps the ache, it keeps the pressure of a ladder round. I feel the ladder sway as the boughs bend, and I keep hearing from the cellar bin the rumbling sound of load on load of apples coming in, for I have had too much of apple picking. I am overtired of the great harvest I myself desired. There were 10,000 fruit to touch, cherish in hand, let down and not let fall. For all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider apple heap, as of no worth. One can see what will trouble this sleep of mine, whatever sleep it is. Were he not gone, the woodchuck could say whether it's like his long sleep as I describe its coming on, or just some human sleep.
By 1912, Frost had written some of his greatest poems. Only a few had appeared in minor publications. He'd failed at poultry farming, but spent 2 successful years teaching locally. At 38, after 10 years in Derry, New Hampshire, he decided to sell his farm and take his family to England.
I don't think it's possible to overestimate the calculation, maybe a better word is to say genius, with which Frost laid out his career while he was here in England. He arrived here with pretty nearly completed 3 books of poetry, A Boy's Will, North of Boston, and Mountain Interval. He published 2 of these here, very different from one another. In A Boy's Will, you have some of Frost's greatest poems in the lyric mode, short poems. In North of Boston, you have nothing but great dramatic monologues, I think perhaps the best he was ever to write. What he wanted to clinch was a reputation back home as the great American poet of his time, and knew that the best way to do this was to establish a critical consensus to that effect among the influential reviewers in England of a kind which didn't exist in the United States.
I'd never been discouraged in America. I'd never been very much encouraged. I'd had sporadic poems in the magazines, but nobody'd ever written me as good a letter of acceptance as some people get of rejection. And I got over there in England with the idea of writing a novel or a play to put the family on its feet. And one night I sat on the floor and looked my poems over and made up a little book and took it into a strange publisher, and in 3 days signed a contract. But I owe a lot to the British, you see, for that. It might have happened here, I don't know whether it could or not, but they were very nice to me. It was a very grand time I had.
London at this time attracted a vital literary community. Among the poets living there were Yeats and the influential American Ezra Pound, a leading exponent of modernism, a movement that would soon dominate the cultural scene with its vision of a world in fragments. While A Boy's Will was being prepared for publication, Frost met the poet F.S. Flint at the Monroe Bookshop. Flint arranged an introduction to Pound, who then wrote a favorable review of A Boy's Will, emphasizing its regional flavor. Frost wrote, "You're not going to make the mistake Pound makes of assuming that my simplicity is that of the untutored child. I am not undesigning." In 1914, the Frost family moved to Gloucestershire, a farming district in the south of England.
The reason I came to England was triple. My wife's wish to live under thatch. The other was to live cheap, see and write poetry, have my time to myself for 2 or 3 years. I sold my farm behind me over there, burned my ships to come over. Didn't go traveling, we settled right down there to stay. And the third reason was, I suppose, the great tradition of English lyric poetry. You know, the best book of all to me when I was young was Palgrave's Golden Treasury. Then my mother gave me a Shelley, a Keats, And Keats has sort of become my poet in a way. Shelley never so much. Browning, every Tennyson, one of the greatest to me over and over again is Chaucer, you know.
He had come to this place, he called it the land of the golden treasury of English poetry, partly in order to test his strength against such poets as Yeats and Pound, the American poet who was then living here, but also, I think, to establish his credentials as a poet with a critical establishment that was stronger than any at home and that would mean a great deal to the people at home when they heard about it. And he succeeded in this, particularly with the help not only of Pound's reviews, but the reviews of a friend of his who lived nearby here, Edward Thomas, who did, I think, the best reviews perhaps ever written of A Boy's Will and North of Boston.
They met at the end of 1913 in London. He set out, rather like Frost, 20 years before, to be a famous writer, a great writer. And what he'd ended up doing was simple hack work. And it wasn't until he met Frost that he really understood that he'd taken the wrong direction. Frost poems such as The Road Not Taken is a very crucial poem for Edward Thomas, who understood exactly what that meant.
I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. I had a friend that I had more in mind that way. Never mind which way he went, he'd be sorry he didn't go the other, and he'd go on forever into eternity, sighing. He had a melancholy about everything that I don't have, you know. I can mock anything out of my system. Edward Thomas, poet.
This is the beginning of a poem that Edward Thomas wrote about his friendship with Frost. The sun used to shine while we two walked slowly together, paused, started again, and sometimes mused, sometimes talked as either pleased, and cheerfully parted each night. We never disagreed which gate to rest on. But they were spending a lot of time walking and talking and finding out just how much they had in common. Thomas had spent many years feeling extremely sorry for himself, suffering from severe and deep depression. Frost probably recognized in Thomas certain traits in himself that he had faced and overcome. And he was a very much more robust and sort of combative personality. He was almost pugnacious, wasn't he? And he sort of said to Thomas on one occasion that he would like to kick all the nonsense out of him.
Back in about 1914, when you were probably 9 or 10 years old, there was an episode where Frost and Thomas were taking a walk, and a gamekeeper on Lord Beecham's estate confronted them. And Frost is supposed to have got enraged and challenged the gamekeeper to a fight, or said he would beat him up. Do you remember hearing about that? Or?
Yes, yeah. He said, come out over the fence. He said, no. Teach you a lesson. He said, come on. Put him up.
Frost spent time in Dimmock with his friends, the Georgian poets La Salle, Abercrombie, Wilfred Gibson, and others living in the area. They met at cottages with names like The Gallows and The Old Nail Shop. In letters and notebooks of this period, Frost was already defining his theory about poetry and the speaking voice. He called it the sound of sense. I give you a new definition of a sentence. A sentence is a sound in itself, on which other sounds, called words, may be strung. I alone of English writers have consciously set myself to make music out of what I may call the sound of sense. The best place to get the abstract sound of sense is from voices behind a door that cuts off the words. Ask yourself how these sentences would sound without the words in which they're embodied. You mean to tell me you can't read? I said no such thing. Well, read then. You're not my teacher. These sentence sounds are definite entities. They are apprehended by the ear. They are gathered by the ear from the vernacular and brought into books. The most original writer only catches them fresh from talk.
Frost's theories were revolutionary in the sense that they wanted to get rid of, as did Pound, as did Eliot, of some of the more familiar phraseologies of Victorian poetry.
Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast.
Mending Wall is an example of the way in which Frost can be too easily understood. I think the line that most people remember for that poem is, "Good fences make good neighbors." In fact, the energies of the poem are directed against that proposition. It's made clear that it's a notion in the head of a man who brings the stones to the wall and is spoken of as like an old stone savage armed.
I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only, in the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, "Good fences make good neighbors."
Those two lines, "He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only, in the shade of trees." Those are lines that it seems to me can bring a shiver, and that coming so quickly, is so close upon the heels as they do of the colloquial, I could say, elves to him, shows, I think, the remarkable nature of the instrument, the flexibility and the subtlety that Frost has brought into blank verse, has brought into poetry. It's a subtlety that neither Tennyson or Swinburne, for all their genius, were capable of. He says he's going to go back home, get a farm, and grow yankier and yankier. Well, that's the conscious forging with humor, always with some humor, of a kind of myth.
Eliot directly addressed the notion of Frost as a regional poet. And he said that he was no more a regional poet than Goethe was a poet of the Rhineland. He is a New England poet in the sense, I suppose, that the speech patterns to which he seems to be alluding seem to occur there. The subject matter of his poems, if you really want to treat them as being about the weather, that is, about snow, about deserted places, deserted farmhouses, the estrangements between people living under conditions of barrenness, the subjects as easily belong to the central concerns of Romantic poetry.
The poem which I wish I had written in the 20th century, I mean, there are several, but one of my anthology of poems which passed the jealousy test, you say, oh, wish I'd written that. It certainly would be Home Burial. There's an element of self-accusation in a poem like Home Burial, if we see it in the context of Frost's own life, where they had a dead child, and obviously we can read Home Burial as some kind of record of husband-wife relations in the aftermath of that.
What is it you see from up there always? For I want to know.
He saw her from the bottom of the stairs before she saw him. And immediately you're in a situation of a trap that's going to be sprung somehow or other.
Don't. Don't go. Don't carry it to someone else this time. Tell me about it if it's something human. Let me into your grief. I'm not so much unlike other folks as your standing there apart would make me out. Give me my chance. I do think, though, you overdo it a little. What was it brought you up to think it the thing to take your mother loss of a first child so inconsolably in the face of love? You'd think his memory might be satisfied.
There you go, sneering now.
I'm not. I'm not. You make me angry. I'll come down to you. God, what a woman. And it's come to this. A man can't speak of his own child that's dead.
You can't. Because you don't know how to speak. If you had any feelings, you that dug with your own hand, how could you, his little grave? I saw you from that very window there, making the gravel leap and leap in air, leap up like that, and land so lightly and roll back down the mound beside the hole. I thought, who is that man? I didn't know you. And I crept down the stairs and up the stairs to look again, and still your spade kept lifting. Then you came in. I heard your rumbling voice out in the kitchen. And I don't know why, but I went near to see with my own eyes. You could sit there with the stains on your shoes, the fresh earth from your own baby's grave, and talk about your everyday concerns. You had stood the spade up against the wall outside there in the entry, for I saw it.
I shall laugh the worst laugh I ever laughed. I'm cursed. God, if I don't believe I'm cursed.
I can repeat the very words you were saying. 3 foggy mornings and 1 rainy day will rot the best birch fence a man can build. Think of it. Talk like that at such a time. What had how long it takes a birch to rot to do with what was in the darkened parlor. You couldn't care. Nearest friends can go with anyone to death comes so far short. You might as well not try to go at all. No. From the time when one is sick to death, one is alone. And he dies more alone. Friends make pretense of following to the grave. But before one is in it, their minds are turned and making the best of their way back to life. And living people. And things they understand. But the world is evil. I won't have grief so if I can change it. Oh, I won't. I won't.
There. You have said it all, and you feel better. You won't go now. You're crying. Close the door. The heart's gone out of it. Why keep it up? Amy, there's someone coming down the road.
You think the talk is all. I must go somewhere out of this house. How can I make
If you do, where do you mean to go? First tell me that. I'll follow and bring you back by force. I will.
When the Frost family returned from England in 1915, they bought a farm. Frost was to own property in New Hampshire and Vermont for the rest of his life. Frost claimed a fierce devotion to his wife and children. He said once that he had stuck to only two things: poetry and family. He began making public appearances across the states and teaching, chiefly at Amherst and the University of Michigan.
They met in high school, and it so happened that they both were co-valedictorians at the graduation ceremony. The title of the Frost piece was Monument to Afterthoughts Unveiled. What's more important is the title of her valedictorian talk, which was Conversation as the Force of Life. Between those two, you have the definition of Frost poetry, at least of that period, well, kind of dating up to, going up to north of Boston. Well, it's precisely that combination of those two things. And given the fact that man was in love with that woman, yeah, I think her perceptions of, well, her perception of the phenomenon of conversation presumably played some role in whatever he was doing about the time. I first read Frost when I think I was 23 or 24. It was way back in Russia, that is in the previous incarnation. And what I've read him obviously first in the, was the translation. And I sort of, when I've read it, I couldn't believe it for the moment, because I thought that somebody terribly clever, doing kind of some kind of apocryphal job, yeah, creating an American poet. Well, I was so stunned because the sensibility was totally alien to me. This poem, at least the beginning of it, gives you a fairly good idea, and a slightly different idea of what his attitude towards nature was.
This is called the woodpile. Out walking in the frozen swamp one gray day, I paused and said, I will turn back from here. No, I will go on further, and we shall see.
This is a poem about him in this kind of situation in the frozen swamp. But the point is, it's kind of a self-referential poem, because apart from anything else, woodpile against the snow background looks like a poem against the white page.
The hard snow held me, save where now and then one foot went through. The view was all in lines straight up and down, of tall, slim trees, too much alike to mark or name a place by, so as to say for certain I was here or somewhere else. I was just far from home. A small bird flew before me. He was careful to put a tree between us when he lighted, and say no word to tell me who he was who was so foolish as to think what he thought. He thought that I was after him for a feather, the white one in his tail, like one who takes everything said as personal to himself. One fight out sideways would have undeceived him, and then there was a pile of wood for which I forgot him and let his little fear carry him off the way I might have gone without so much as wishing him good night. He went behind it to make his last stand. It was a cord of maple, cut and split and piled and measured, 4 by 4 by 8. And not another like it could I see. No runner tracks in this year's snow ran near it. And it was older, sure, than this year's cutting, or even last year's, or the years before. The wood was gray, and the bark warping off it, and the pile somewhat sunken. Clematis had wound strings round it like a bundle. What held it, though, on one side was a tree still growing, and on one a stake and prop, these latter about to fall. I thought that only someone who lived in turning to fresh tasks could so forget his handiwork on which he spent himself, the labor of his axe, and leave it there far from a useful fireplace to warm the frozen swamp as best it could with the slow, smokeless burning of decay. We rise out of disorder into order, and the poems that I make are little bits of order. See? if I made basket or a piece of pottery, you know, a vase or something. And if you suffer any sense of confusion in life, the best thing you can do is make little forms, blow cigarette smoke rings, see? Even those have form, you know.
Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade.
While America was gripped by the Great Depression, Europe was moving toward disaster. Frost insisted that both modernist despair and New Deal planning were harmful because they disregarded the individual's innate capacity to act, despite confusion and disorder. Like William James, Frost believed that there are no large solutions and that truths are momentary.
Some have relied on what they knew, others on being simply true. What worked for them might work for you. No memory of having starred makes up for later disregard or keeps the end from being hard. Better to go down dignified with boughten friendship at your side than none at all. Provide, provide. Once I said that in the good old days of the 30s to someone in Washington, with someone in Washington sitting right in front of me, and I wound it up with more of this intonation that I talk about. I said, better to go down dignified with boughten friendship at your side than none at all. Provide, provide. Or somebody else will provide for you. And then I added, and how will you like that? See, I got two good tones in on top of the poem.
When I first met Robert Frost, I was an executive of Henry Holt & Company in New York City. I was young at the time, I'd just come with the company shortly before that, and he wanted to meet the new man. And so we had our first meeting right in my office in New York City. He began to question me about my background, where I'd come from, who I was. And that evolved into a relationship where we found a lot in common. I'd been an athlete, and he liked that. He liked the vigorous attitudes that I brought to my life. And he also discovered that my wife's name was Eleanor.
In 1938, while in Florida with her husband, Eleanor Frost died of a heart attack. This was the second of 3 losses to occur to Frost within a period of 6 years. 4 years earlier, Frost's favorite daughter, Marjorie, had died of a fever after giving birth to her first child. In 1940, Frost's son, Carol, committed suicide. Frost wrote to his daughter, Leslie, concerning Eleanor. My, what sorrow runs through all she wrote to you children. No wonder something of it overcasts my poetry, if read aright. She was not as original as I in thought, but she dominated my art with the power of her character and nature. I wish I hadn't this woeful suspicion that toward the end she came to resent something in the life I had given her.
I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night.
eventually, of course, made him a public figure more than just a person who had spoken at colleges and to selective audiences. We put him on television for the first time and brought him out with recordings of his works. He was delighted with this. At first, he stepped back from it. He didn't want that kind of an image. Showbiz was not his thing, he said, but he was a ham at heart, and he loved the public aspects of it. And after we did our first show with Spivak on television, Spivak told me that the mail was tremendous.
Mr. Frost, why do you take so many of your images and metaphors from the world of games and sports?
It's a strange thing that I do. I played games, I suppose, and I don't think anybody can think right in this world who didn't play games sometime in his life. I'd as soon write free verse as play tennis with the net down. That brought tennis in.
Do you know that during World War II, I don't really know, the Defense Department, I think, issued a paper box of Frost's with those terrific drawings by O'Hara under the series What We're Fighting For. And, well, that was precisely the moment of Frost's greatest popularity. Well, because that book was read in the army, well, whatever it is, by the soldiers, etc., etc. Well, and they liked it a hell of a lot, yeah? Well, and I don't think, frankly, that you could do the same thing to any work of T.S. Eliot or Sid of Pound.
Frost would have been popular, even had he chosen not to be, by the nature of his commitment to what he called the sound of sense and sentence sounds. The fact that readers chose to look not at those delicate inflections in speech, but instead emphasized the common subject matter of his poems, is nothing that he could control, and certainly nothing that he wanted. He was, of all the poets of the 20th century, the one most closely associated with the select few who live in and at the university. More than Eliot, Pound, Stevens, Crane, any of them, he chose to do a good part of his work in universities as a teacher, to live at colleges like Amherst for extended periods of time. And it was therefore extremely appropriate that he received so many honorary degrees. In fact, he had the hoods of these honorary degrees made into a blanket. The blanket was unfortunately presented to him before he received the 2 degrees that meant most to him, those from Oxford, where we are now at Balliol College in 1957, and Cambridge University in the same year.
It was funny the way I had got to be educated by degrees. Degree giving, dation, you see, that's Latin, degradation. Same. That's the way I've got educated. And
He liked to dabble a little bit in politics, and so we got to know some of the people in Washington through his being consultant to the Library of Congress.
I wish it wouldn't grow into a great big, department. I wish to stay like that in the White House. I've just been saying that for the president, that I wish it would stay aesthetic, and not get too cultural, calculated and all that, It can't help it. It'll go, but I wish it would stay as long as it can, really aesthetic. Not get too damn departmental,
He had sat at a dinner in Boston when Kennedy was a young senator and told the old cardinal that he thought young Kennedy someday would be president of the United States. And it was prophetic. He was invited to come down to the White House, and he was given a congressional medal. And at that time, Kennedy, of course, getting in a little political plug, said, "Well, Mr. Frost, you've been a good Democrat all your life, haven't you?"
Oh, everybody knows the way I vote. You know, from my books, they don't like that. They don't like to ask me. It's not polite. But you can tell if you read all my works, you can tell just what I am. I've been a Democrat all my life, but I've been a little unhappy since 1896.
Kennedy loved it. He loved the freshness of the remark.
All is honesty.
In 1958, in honor of Frost's 85th birthday, a dinner was held in New York at the Waldorf Astoria, at which the critic Lionel Trilling spoke. That speech created a controversy.
Lionel Trilling, when he finally got round to acknowledging the existence of Frost, I think, could only acknowledge it by turning Frost into the kind of modernist, quote, terrifying, unquote, poet, which he distinctly was not and never chose to be.
Some people didn't want to hear Robert Frost described as the great bard of adrenaline, as the poet of terror and perhaps also of fear and hatred. They wanted the genial old sage of legend, of contemporary myth. Other people, I think, felt that they'd known all along that Frost was a poet of adrenaline, and that Trilling was patronizing them a little bit by pretending to have discovered it for the first time.
It sort of changed the image of what the gray-haired, wonderful, old sweet man was thought to be, and his poetry did not perhaps follow that image. That there were depths of the man and dark places and vigor in him that we hadn't suspected in that white-haired, gentle old New England poet. He wasn't a gentle old New England poet. He was a ferocious, active man in so many different ways.
Forget the myth. There's no one I am put out with or put out by. Unless I'm wrong, I but obey the urge of a song. I'm bound away, and I may return if dissatisfied with what I learned from having died. See, that's the death poem. And that raises this amusing question, you know, with everybody making other meanings to everything. That's a straight-out death poem. And it's straight goods.
I think that Trilling's speech, as I remember its general drift, was quite simply true. And that one of the extraordinary things about Frost is that he had the guts to write about fear and hatred and the terror of emptiness as he did.
The poems for which I think he will be valued forever aren't just the dark poems, aren't just the negative poems, but those poems of temperate and just balance between negative and positive aspects and experience. He does inhabit the world at body heat.
You have to like this, whether you like it or not. It happens to be an old-fashioned phrase form. It's about a lady's voice. The name of the poem is Never Again Would Bird's Song Be the Same. See? Never again would bird's song be the same. He would declare and could himself believe that the birds there in all the garden round, from having heard the day-long voice of Eve, had added to their own an oversound, her tone of meaning, though without the words. Admittedly, an eloquence so soft could only have had an influence on birds when call of laughter carried it aloft. Be that as may be, she was in their song. Moreover, her voice upon their voices crossed had now persisted in the woods so long that probably it never would be lost. Never again would bird's song be the same, and to do that to birds was why she came. Let's leave it that way, shall we?
Major funding for the Voices and Visions series is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Annenberg Media.
Additional series funding is provided by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. Special funding for this program is provided by the Pew Memorial Trust and the Vermont Council on the Humanities and Public Issues.
For information about this and other Annenberg Media programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.